Good afternoon and happy lunchtime. My name is Fernando Lopez. I'm the Executive Director of San Diego Pride. I use they, them, their pronouns. And welcome back to another LGBT Q&A here at San Diego Pride. And we are so excited to have California State Assemblymember Alex Lee joining us today from the 25th Assembly District. Please welcome Alex Lee.
Hey everyone, happy to be here.
Hi there. Thank you so much. I know you're got a crazy busy schedule, so really appreciate you taking time out of your day to be here with us today.
Absolutely.
So, you know, I follow you on Twitter, huge fan. And I just wanted to ask, you know, congratulations. You've made history on a few different fronts. You're the youngest API member of the state legislature, and you were also first openly bisexual member of the state legislature. So can you tell me just how you are and how elected life has been?
Yeah, well, certainly I have the great distinction and honor of carrying a lot of firsts. As you mentioned, I'm the first openly bisexual state legislator, the youngest Asian American state legislator ever, and youngest current state legislator and first Gen Z state legislator. But I take those first to be very as big responsibility. You know, it's my mission in life to make sure we have more young queer people of color, or you know, people of all ages as well, you know, to be in office to represent our viewpoints and make sure that our lived experiences are in office. Because I cannot tell you how many times that one way or another, we all live obviously intersectional identities and different lives, right? But how often that in decision making, sometimes it's very like sexual orientation blind or color blind sometimes, and that decision making is not always the most prudent decision making, and unfortunately sometimes we're an afterthought. But if we have more people of color and we have more queer people in office, that hopefully will not be the case anymore. We won't be afterthoughts. Luckily, you know, we are included. We're not a first thought to be rejected, but we're an afterthought to be added, which is still not great either. I mean, so there's a lot to be done. So most of my work up here in the first 6 months in office is to really advocate and make sure that people are included in our decision-making space. It's quite often that in Sacramento we make really big decisions, you know, with a lot of money attached to it. But sometimes if we don't stop and ask ourselves, how are everyday people actually going to access these resources, it often can get pretty messy, as we've seen from many different instances. But that's mostly what's going on right now. It's pretty exhausting half the time. I'm not gonna lie. It's a lot that's happening, obviously, during a global pandemic right now. But it's fun. It's fun half the time as well.
I'm sure, and having to do all of this right in the middle of a pandemic and learn a new job in the middle of a pandemic, I'm sure is not easy. And you know, we're so fortunate to be here in San Diego, where we have so many LGBTQ elected officials. Senator Tony Atkins, obviously our mayor, Tug Gloria, was in the assembly just before he became our mayor. We've got Chris Ward up there right now too. So it's so great to have that representation, and I'm excited that you brought up the piece about being the first Gen Z elected official at the state legislature, because I think that's important. You are bringing a different perspective, and there is a distinction between the sorts of policies that you're promoting and that you've been advocating for, maybe then some of the older generation of LGBTQ advocates and pioneers who, you know, paved that path and fought for things that they could, and now you're pushing forward in a new way. So I'm actually going to skip this second question, but go to the next one, which is, you know, I understand you were raised in a family of immigrants, so was I. And how have those experiences impacted your political career and some of the policy choices that you're pushing for?
Yeah, absolutely. So my family came here from Hong Kong which is obviously a special. Now it is a special administrative district of the People's Republic of China. There's a whole history there in politics happening right now, obviously with Hong Kong, but they immigrated to where I represent now, where I grew up in Milpitas in North San Jose. So my district covers parts of Alameda and Santa Clara counties, and actually my district is one of two Asian majority districts in the Assembly, actually, which is quite unique. Obviously, right now we're in Asia Pacific Islander Heritage Month, which is a really important time for our community, and especially so with all the Asian hate instances that are happening, unfortunately, resurging in this country. But what's really important is, I grew up in, and I think you still look at the demographics of my high school, it was like probably like over 50% Asian, and I remember the first time realizing that is not the case for everyone in California. Like once you travel to another state or even a couple hours away from, my hometown, it's like not everyone is actually Asian, like where I'm from. So it's really important to understand that. But it's also really important, and a thing that I take with me is because I think I valued how important like diversity in action really is, and it's where like there's so many people from so many different backgrounds where it's almost becomes, in a good way, you take it for granted because it's just like, oh, this is just how it is, right? It's not that you have someone who is your Asian friend or something and they're so unique, they're so special or something, or if any race, right? But it's just like they exist. It's just part of their identity, and that's part of your friend, that's part of your family's friend. And I think that's how it ought to be in our great melting pot society, right? It was just like you have a neighbor down the street and they're a queer Black person, or they're a person up the street and they're an older white straight person, and that's just how it is. That's how a community should be, because I think oftentimes as our society is constantly developing, and I think we're in a trajectory of like exponential change, rather than seeing people in these like boxes or categories like, oh, you're like this, you're different, you're special. But it's like everyone is different. We know we all have different things in our lives, and I think it impacts us. And I guess another thing I would touch upon is, being from the Asian community, there's still a long ways to go with acceptance of the LGBT community, a lot of education, and a lot of, frankly, tolerance that still needs to be built. But I think that's improving across time as more and more people find their voice and find their way and figuring out their identity. It's more important than ever. You and I grew up when Prop 8 was passed, so as a young person, having the state ratify basically that same-sex marriage or being homosexual is not okay, I think that had a big imprint on people. But I think as time has moved on, and I think we've learned from these mistakes as a society, I've seen more and more people openly express themselves and figure out they are queer, they are bisexual, they are gay or lesbian. And I think it's less stigma now. And I think we're actually moving to a point where I think for younger people, especially, even the concept of coming out might be a relic of the past, I think, which is a great thing.
Yeah, totally.
Right? You just exist. Because, obviously for straight folks, I always ask them this, because some people ask me, like, when did you come out? And I was like, when did you come out straight?
And that's progress, right? You're not having to come out as readily, and or as in that like really definitive moment that perhaps my generation had to experience. I turned 40 this year. I'm a little different generation, but so yeah. But it's funny too what you said. I also grew up in the Imperial Valley, which was 85% Latino, and so I had that very similar experience. It was like 85% Latino, like 5%, I think it was 5% white and like 10% other. So I moved to San Diego, which was drastically different demographically speaking, and I had that similar experience. Like, oh, this is not what I was used to, and so I think moving here, having that lens being shifted, sort of impacts like, from a legislative perspective, from a policy perspective, I might have different lens on policy values and legislative work than someone who maybe was born and raised in this community. So are there some specific, I'm going to go to the specific policies that you might be championing that you feel were informed by that lens?
Yeah, absolutely. I think an example I use quite often now, and it's very material, good example, is especially like, Brenda, when we both grow up in essentially what you would call minority majority communities. I don't quite like the term, but it kind of puts the idea across. Right. Is again that sense that we cannot constantly be culturally neutral or race blind to all our issues. And something that really brought up to my attention was when we were doing a lot of urgent big items to combat the coronavirus and all the pandemic response. So initially, this administration, our state administration, had big goals of getting a lot of vaccines out to everyone, getting tests done to folks. but the initial rounds were not yielding the results we wanted. And I think they were pondering how come that's the case. And thanks to a lot of advocacy from the legislature, we're saying, well, you essentially it boiled down to you weren't meeting the community where they were. There's no language access. You're telling people to go on this app that's all in English and to perhaps drive to some location. And for so many different reasons, right? Whether it be language barrier, technology barrier, or transportation barrier. Like we think about our elders in our community, like, are they really gonna go find this app, download it, and then sign up for these appointments where it's very confusing? I mean, it's confusing enough for people who are tech savvy to be
for any of us.
Exactly. There's already too much going on, right? But like to expect these people to also go and go out and do these things is probably a lot, right? So as we built out the funding for working with community-based organizations to get relevant information in languages and working with people who are trusted, our vaccine testing rates went up a lot better. Obviously right now, today, we still have vaccine hesitancy for different reasons, I would say. But before, I think it was more of a barrier access problem, right? And I think it was unfortunately causing a lot of consternation, right? Because if you look at the pure data early on, where it's like, oh, people of color weren't getting the vaccine, does that mean something's wrong with people of color or something happening? And it was like, well, most of just don't know. It was like, that was the problem, right? So like that, I think, is very tangible material benefit of when you have people who understand these lived experiences, and we can go, well, duh, of course that wasn't going to work because you didn't do it this way, right?
Absolutely. And then there's these wonderful community organizations like Equality California doing this education work, multilingual education work. I know we've been a part of that in partnership with them and working with our county. And it was really remarkable. So we just did a trans vaccination clinic because we understand, right, being from the LGBT community, sort of the health barriers and negative experiences that our community might face when approaching a healthcare situation. And so we vaccinated 400 or over 400 transgender and non-binary, gender non-conforming individuals in one day, just from having that vaccination clinic in a safe space where folks knew that it was and had multilingual access in a platform that was easier to use than what the county did. And it's those like small tweaks that aren't necessarily that small when you're doing it on a statewide systemic region as big as the state of California, but those steps are so important.
Yeah, no, it's just a huge demonstration of when you meet people where they're at. It's just so important. And I have to give a shout out to State Senator Scott Wiener, who has been on the champion of this front for many different fronts. But he passed the bill to get LGBTQ tracking data when it comes to the pandemic testing and all that stuff. And I think, unfortunately, to this day, the agencies have been really behind in it. So obviously, it's awesome that so many of our trans community members were able to get it. That, like, for a large part, the state was kind of flying blind when it came to our community. Like obviously, there's a lot of importance in knowing, right? Because then we know how many people who are Hispanic or Asian were getting the vaccine. But for our community, it was kind of like anecdotal. I mean, it's not the best way to do policy, but certainly quite holds us back. So that's also an unfortunate example of where we weren't included. And hopefully things will work out. But it's hard. It's hard to tell where we're at.
So now, like you brought up an interesting point. So I'm going to go off script and ask a wonky question. So what is your perspective on the collection of SOGI data, or sexual orientation, gender identity data, from just a health code or compliance issue or any sort of avenue of public health and services where folks have to go through an intake process? That's one of the barriers to data access that you're talking about right now, is that we've slowly been chipping away at this collecting sexual orientation and gender identity data, but we don't yet have comprehensive statewide policy on collecting that data so we can make better decisions. What's your perspective on that? Yeah,
I'll say, there's a lot of, I think from a fundamental principle standpoint, I think there's still a lot of, fundamentally, I don't know how to phrase it, but fundamentally the government is still kind of behind the private sector when it comes to data, right? So I represent the communities of Silicon Valley, and obviously a lot of people know how the worth of big data is, right, and metadata. But it's not so much just like, oh, they go look at me, Alex Lee, and I'm a 25-year-old bisexual Asian man, right? There's not so much data in just one singular point, but a lot in the whole universe, right? And why it's so valuable because it can tell you a lot about the whole population or demographic changes, right? And that's why capitalism grabs these things so much. But from a public data, from a public health or a public safety standpoint, these things can also be very important. It's about balancing the privacy and the anonymization of the individual, right? But on the aggregate level, they're so informative to, how we deploy vaccines to certain impacted zip codes. How do we make sure that, we're showing all these different data trends, but it just seems the LGBT community in this certain city are not getting vaccine. What's that, right? It allows us to ask the right questions that are data driven. So it's right about that balance. And I think, I actually haven't heard it pronounced out loud before, so Soji, but I think having that data done in a very meaningful and careful way will help us make better public policy, because for most of the majority of LGBT history, we have been marginalized, put off to the sideline. But if the data is used in a right, meaningful way, we can actually help uplift a lot of people, as we know anecdotally and from the data points we do know, how our communities are impacted by a lot of violence, by a lot of discrimination, and by a lot of isolation in every sense.
And I think you touched on a really good point there, which is historically our community can be so terrified to be out in any setting, a medical setting, or any way that someone's maybe seeking public housing or public assistance. Coming out as LGBT can be traumatizing. There can be violence, there lack of care and service when you approach those settings. Even knowing that our state has been on the front lines of passing legal protection for our community. So I understand the hesitancy there, but then we run into those challenges where our service providers so often give these anecdotal sort of evidence to our legislators and lawmakers, and then what we hear in return is, well, where are the data? Well, we don't have data, and that's why organizations like the Williams Institute over at UCLA become so important, because they're doing survey data and research, but at the same time we don't yet have that real definitive data coming through these service and care agencies. And I don't know if it's come across your desk yet, but HRC finally just released a study on the importance of including SOGI data in some of these government bodies and service agencies. So I'm hopeful to see California start to lead in that way as well. So not just California, but the rest of the country can start to look at that data responsibly and make some better decisions on how we can look at equitable solutions for our community.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, thanks for letting me veer off for a little bit. I obviously feel a little passionately about SOGI data. So you talked about coming from a marginalized community, or a marginalized community. You talked about coming from a community or representing a district that is over 50% API. And there's been a disgusting amount of increase in hate and violence and discrimination. And just wanted to ask, how has that impacted you personally? How has it impacted your work and what you plan to do to represent your district?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly difficult to see in the last year or so the really strong resurgence in anti-Asian racism that has existed. And I mean, looking back kind of at the recent past, it's not a big surprise, I guess, in hindsight, that this has happened when you had the most powerful person in the world, the President of the United States, saying things like Chinese virus, Wuhan flu. You still have U.S. senators today trying to block international students from coming because they think they're Chinese spies or something, even though sometimes they're Taiwanese, which is funny to me. But so it's just, there's a lot of xenophobia, xenophobia, and, in general, anti-Asian hatred and sentiment out there. And as we've seen this in our history all the time, right? When material conditions get bad, some people start blaming and scapegoating, right? We see this with the Black community, we see this with the Latino community. It happens all the time. But I think what I see the silver lining right now about the community getting together and really saying we should stop Asian hate is that a lot of people are now connecting dots between the shared struggle, as it has always existed, right? The racism, the rising tide of racism that affects the Black community, that affects the Latino community, and has been institutionalized in all our laws and stuff, is the same stuff that is affecting our community. We're in the spotlight right now, but I think a lot more people are understanding, oh, I see how the BLM protests exist now and how that relates to us. I see how, Homeland Security and ICE deportations are connected to our community now. And I think that's really important, waking up in a point, because as we've always seen in history, when all of our communities are banded together, we're always stronger together in fighting these forced institutional racism. And something I'm always reminded of is, I'm here in the state capitol at the very moment, but, thinking about when I go to my desk, because those desks are very old, those are relics, I would think probably there are the generations of legislators sat at the same desk as me who would be incredibly repulsed that a queer young Asian person is now at their desk. But I think that also shows a lot of progress and a lot of almost unlearning from the state we have to do, or undoing, pulling back these layers. So that's what we're working on. And it really, to me, I think it's just so pressing. I never thought I would be thrust kind of in this situation as an Asian American leader to have to confront the racism in this moment like this. But it's important in remembering that we have a shared struggle, the same struggle of all communities of color, with the LGBT community, and even, so many different communities.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that it's finally, this last year in particular, this rise in LGBT violence and trans-specific violence and immigrant deportation and violence, API hate and violence, more and more the violence that's been targeted towards the Black community, whether by everyday people or law enforcement, all of those things are sort of becoming visible, and we're all finding collectively able to say, oh, well, these systems of white supremacy have been so ingrained in the fabric of media and education and our laws. How can we collectively work together to put a stop to that? So I'm right there with you, and hoping and being more hopeful. I see our communities coming together and working together more. Are there some ways that you've seen folks working together more collaboratively that have been inspiring to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I especially remember this because it was earlier on in the year, there was a lot of people explicitly putting together the struggles of, justice for Black lives, and also the problems happening with the Asian American community right now, because there's a lot of tension. I mean, that's kind of the elephant in the room sometimes, is a lot of the hate incidents happen are from other people of color. And, it's hard to sometimes wrap your head initially why these are all perpetuating of the system of white supremacy, because on the surface, you can be very reductive, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's more and more people who are realizing these things. And I think they're using those forces within that energy to champion things like what we're working on the state budget here with with the state legislature here. Like, we're putting $200 million, and that has a lot of community support too in the budget, in the state budget right now, on things like education, victim resources, a reporting hotline, a lot of great things that don't just tread on the old systems that uphold white supremacy, but really trying to move us out of it and dismantle it. So it's a lot of great effort. And a lot of these, I would say a lot of these solutions and these ideas have come from community groups and community organizers. So I'm really glad a lot of this is now making it institutionally into our budget too.
Yeah, it's been great to see. And I just saw the governor announce finally having some funding go towards training teachers on how to be better on LGBTQ issues. And part of that work, even there too, when we were working on passing the FAIR Act, I think it was 2011 or 2012, to have more inclusive curriculum. Even that was about unwhitewashing, unmalewashing, and unstraightwashing our history. And it was also about including people with disabilities in our education system as well, and making sure that we're telling this full, authentic narrative around who really was a part of this country and the fabric of this country. And ultimately, if we can show the breadth and the vibrancy of the diversity of our communities through our history courses, which is just showing the reality, I think over the long term that will help to dispel some of this hate, some of this fear from just like not knowing. And what you talked about was racial triangulation and different people from different ethnicities, targeting each other. But those are also systems of white supremacy, because we don't understand each other. We don't always know each other. We didn't grow up next to each other, just seeing each other as our neighbors and our friends. We grew up in these very redlined districts, right? Or redlined communities.
Yeah, absolutely. So I like that term you said. Was it unstraightwashing or unstraight? Yeah. One or the other. Yeah, that's important. That's what we got to do in our history. You got to straightwashing it.
Yeah, and I'm excited to see that work happening and finally being funded at the state level. So I'm just really appreciative of that. And I know our LGBTQ youth and the teachers around here were really thrilled to see that announcement come through.
Absolutely.
I'm going to go back to one of the questions that we skipped over. So you ran as an out, openly bisexual candidate. And I think that's so important because, one, the bisexual community is by and large the largest portion of the LGBT community, and that so often gets ignored. And there's an immense amount of bi erasure and biphobia, et cetera. Like, can you speak to that and why it was important for you to run as an openly bisexual candidate?
Yeah, certainly running as openly bisexual state legislator was challenging for a couple of reasons. One, because let's face it, there is a certain, I don't know if biphobia is a word, but there's certain biphobia or homophobia, queerphobia, whatever you want to call it, that exists even, in areas you'd say are traditionally blue or something. There are a lot of misconceptions and all that stuff. So it was always a little like, dicey and stuff, especially with I will say certain segments of the Asian population are also not as forward-thinking and not as inclusive. So it was always a little scary at that point, right? But something I think that's also hard is, as you mentioned, bi-erasure that exists very often. I think there is always a temptation to define people's sexuality based on their sexual partners or their romantic partners. But if that were true, like all single people would be asexual. So, so
I haven't heard that one before. I like that. I'm going to use that.
Right, but that's the dilemma that bi people fall into, right? It's that if you date someone who is of the opposite sex, then you're heterosexual, and then if you date someone of the same sex, then they say, "Oh, you're homosexual all along. You're gay," So, and then I hear very often, these treaded notions of like these old notions about like, oh, bisexual people are greedy, they're it's a phase or something, and that's not the case, And for me, being bi, I'm also I would say more strictly speaking, I'm pan, right? Like I don't say that there's only two genders. I think bi is. Hopefully will evolve on this term. I think most people I've met to bi doesn't mean that, oh, I only acknowledge two genders that exist, right? It's like it's just kind of a English thing, English language thing. But yeah, it's just important to speak out and do that. And I was actually very surprised myself to say a lot of people in my community say, oh, I'm bi too, and I've always been hesitant about it. But now that my representative or someone's running an office can talk about these things, it's important, because I can't tell you how many times I've had, especially people of color, who were thinking about it and trying to figure out like, oh, I'm not. Like sometimes a lot of people get this phase where like, oh, I'm not gay enough or I'm not worthy of becoming a member community. And a lot of bi people, I think, fall in that realm where they're just like, am I a phase? Am I what's happening? Like, I don't know if I deserve to be part of the community. And I'm always like, you know yourself the best and you deserve to be loved no matter who you are, even if you're questioning, if you're figuring out, or, so it's just important. And I think there's a lot of people who often feel like they're neglected or they're overlooked, and I'm trying to be here to tell you, like, we're all in the same boat together. It can be confusing sometimes, and it can be uncertain in a world that was obviously not designed for us, but I'm here to help out and try to figure it out. That's why it's important, and that's why it's important to speak out about bisexuality too, and bi visibility.
I love that, and thank you for sharing that. Everything you're saying resonates with what I've heard. We have staff who identify as bisexual. We have bisexual elected officials in our region too, and it's so much what you're saying is the discrimination can often come from you get it from the heterosexual community, you get it from the LGBT community, and so you end up being closeted as a bisexual person, which doesn't help our movement by any measure. And so the more that there are folks like you and other out bisexual folks, pansexual, polysexual folks who are willing to discuss those things openly, publicly, and be visible, that's so powerful. And so just thank you on behalf of the folks in our team. That was really something that was important to our folks, that you were out bisexual. I know that meant a lot to people.
Yeah, well, and I was just gonna say, for members of our community who are watching, definitely give the benefit of your doubt to your friends or peers who are trying to figure it out right now, because it's one thing to be questioned by the hetero community, right? It's like, okay, it's like, but for our community, when you're trying to figure out if you belong to it, and you have people, even it just takes one person to really doubt you, then you doubt yourself, and I think we've all been there, right? Where it's like that doubt can spiral, and so it's important to try to give us benefit of doubt, try to have someone who's a good, essentially, mentor figure. I was lucky; I had really good friends that helped me figure things out, ask the right questions, kind of like get my head. I was gonna say head straight, but no, my head right place. But it's important, to give a helping hand every now.
Absolutely. Well, couldn't agree more. I'm gonna go to one of our next questions, which is, we sort of touched on this a little bit, but I'm wondering if there are any other issues that you haven't mentioned yet that you're really championing at the state level that are of specific importance to the LGBT community.
Yeah, I think we had a great sidebar about soji.
However,
soju is, and in fact, I was about to say soju, which is a Korean alcohol beverage, but so it's important. I would also say is, I think it's two things. One is making sure that our laws and our institutions are also reflective and hospitable to our trans individuals, to trans folks and non-binary folks. I think that is the kind of last institutional barrier, or one of the last institutional barriers that exists, right? I mean, we still have bills going through that will recognize the right names and gender identities of people that have died. And I'm thinking that's cool, but I'm thinking, wow, we still haven't gotten that far yet, where it's like, even when someone is murdered or someone unfortunately loses their life, we're still not identifying them right. You know, we still have those things to build out inclusively, and to make sure then, of course, our history, our education, everything is reflective of all the contributions of everyone in the LGBT community, or including the T part of our community. And that, I think, is still the short side of it. I think we're coming into, luckily, at least this last decade, right, where the most harsh macro aggressions and discriminations against our community are in California, right? That's an important distinction, are becoming things of the past. But we also have to be vigilant in making sure those don't go away, right? Because it's as quickly as we have finally gained mainstream acceptance in most regards, it can still be undermined with harmful actions at the federal level or international, who knows. So that's really important. And something to me that's really important is housing affordability. Coming from the Bay Area, and as anyone in a metropolitan area in California can attest, it is probably way too expensive to live where you live or where you want to live. And this is a double compounded, I think, problem with our community, where, look, if you live in a really expensive area like in San Jose, it might be more in your mind of a mechanism of survival to keep your identity to yourself so you can live with your family, or to live with whatever living conditions you have, than actually becoming homeless. And as we know from the data that we do know, there is a lot of LGBTQ youth homelessness out there. So making sure those folks get housing and the appropriate resources they need is really important to me. But ultimately working so we have a real housing guarantee in the state of California. So I'm working on 4 housing bills right now that range the gamut of everything, but I'm really invested in getting social housing, where we actually deliver housing as a public good, as a social good, because then, the real thing that holds back a lot of people from their dreams or from living authentically in many different ways, right, is fear of losing their housing or fear of losing their healthcare, and obviously fear of social ramifications, right? But the two material things that we can affect, making sure that everyone has healthcare and housing, is something we need to strive for, and hopefully then everyone will be more comfortable living the lives they want to live.
I love that, and I know we understand the myth of the LGBT community, that it's all cis white gay guys who have double income and no kids, and they're so wealthy. And not that there aren't those people who exist in our community, but that is not the majority of our.
Or me, double income, let me up.
And so really, like, our community is often under, there's barrier to access to education, there's barrier to access to employment. And you hit the nail on the head when you say that in our metropolitan areas, which are often beacons of hope and safety for the LGBT community, our community is getting priced out, and so having to move further and further away. So that housing is so important. And you also mentioned healthcare, and I think I've seen you, because I do follow you on Twitter, huge fan. You've talked about healthcare as a public right too. Do you want to share any of your perspectives there as well?
Yeah, just like housing, I think healthcare ought to be a human right. We are pariahs in the developed world where our government doesn't have a very strong investment in our healthcare outcomes. And I am a co-author on CalCare, which would get us universal single-payer healthcare in California as well. And I think it's just outrageous, right? That if the pandemic has shown us anything, employer-based healthcare, which is essentially the system we have in America, if you can call it a system even, is an incredibly faulty way to do healthcare. Because when we had massive unemployment during a health crisis, what did people lose? Their health coverage. And I think we're going to experience a lot of tertiary and secondary effects of that. Right now we still have historic unemployment, historic health disparities, and I don't exactly know what's going to happen with, all the things of delayed care, right? Obviously, a lot of people had been affected by the primary effects of coronavirus, right? But what about all the people that have now lost their healthcare, who need, treatments that they could delay? They could delay for a little bit, but treatments that they necessarily needed, or, whether it comes to diabetes, which is also very prevalent, right? Or any other conditions, what's going to happen there? I think we're going to, unfortunately, maybe see a bit of a delayed effect there, as many things in our society are going to be. But just generally, I think healthcare needs to be something that's prioritized, right? And especially with our LGBT community, where historically we have had different health outcomes and different treatments when it comes to our health, and being discriminated against even certain simple things as giving blood, which obviously they tried to fix right now, but it's still ridiculous. They didn't really fix it, but there's still these barriers there. And if we can make a truly universal, right? No matter how rich or poor you are, no matter how gay or straight you are, if we can really realize these things, we can really make a society that's so much better for everyone.
Well, I'm right there with you. So thank you for being such a vocal advocate for that at this state. Our next question is, what words of advice would you give to a young person? You yourself are a young person, but to an even younger person who is interested in pursuing a career in public service and maybe feeling discouraged because of their ethnic background or sexual identity? What advice would you give?
Yeah, when I started running for the assembly at the age of 23 in 2019, I'm 25 now, and I was in 25th district, so 25. There were a lot of people that, in so many words, were saying, "Oh, you're too young, you're too gay. I mean, you're too queer or bi, whatever they called me back then. You're too Asian, right? You can't do it. You got to wait your turn. You got to figure some stuff out first, right?" And ultimately, it boils into this: what I always tell people my age, even older, it applies to everyone. I think everything is universal, but this is especially true for young people. And I think it resonates in this environment we're growing up in, is I would say, don't let other people's doubt about you become your own doubt. People, and you can be young, I think, when you're under 80 still, like, as long as you have, it's that young youth at heart, right? But it's like, I think all of us have this doubt about ourselves, right? How do we fit in society? Is the job right for us? Am I expressing myself appropriately, like as I want to be? All these doubts about, am I holding myself back? But I think all these doubts always end up making us stronger, right? Because we reevaluate where we're in life. We learn new skills to compensate for these things. We do whatever. But I think basically the doubt from the haters is not constructive. It's usually an excuse just to hate you, essentially, in a way. And I know, especially in the social media environment, in the formative years of our lives right now, it's so easy to. This is why I said, for members of our community, please don't try not to give the benefit of the doubt to people as much as possible, right? But when you hear one negative thing from someone you might value a lot, you really begin to question yourself. But I think the questions you pose to yourself about your own place in society and how you should be are always going to motivate you to be stronger. So if you're really thinking about it and you're like, oh, I should run for office, or maybe I shouldn't, that's a conversation you got to have internally and bounce with the right people you want. Don't just rely on the haters to tell you, oh, you shouldn't run, blah, blah, blah. Because if you let other people define you, which is unfortunately kind of the very abridged macro history of our community, right? Letting people decide what our lives look like, then we won't get to where we want to be. So important, don't let the haters define you.
I love that. And see, a generation older than you, great advice. I appreciate that so much. Actually, I'm not saying that I'm running for office. I was not saying that. I'm saying that don't let other people's doubt about you become your own doubt. I think that's so powerful.
Yeah, and it's true. It's true for running for office, applying to a new job, and all this, or asking for a promotion. All true. Still true.
It's very applicable. And you were right. I think I love that you called it out about our community. We have a relatively small staff here. We've got 11 people. And one of the things that came up for us when we were chatting at one of our last staff retreats was how each person, who I think are brilliant, exceptional, queer people of color, trans, non-binary folks, like every person sitting at that table was talking about imposter syndrome and how they were struggling with imposter syndrome. And I just love that. Don't let other people's doubts about you become your own doubts. It's so powerful. We're weighed down by that social expectation and social perception and bias that other people have. And that's not ours to carry. Thank you for sharing that.
Imposter syndrome, very real in our community, very real.
Yeah, absolutely. I see Kim and Ben are watching. Hi. We got some taking advice to heart, not letting the haters get to you. Absolutely, Ben. Let's see, as a lifelong resident of South Bay, this is a fun question. What are some of your favorite places to go when you're hosting visitors? So we're coming up to visit. Where do you take people? What are your favorite spots?
It's funny because I had to think really hard about this one, because I was like, wow, I haven't done this for over a year, right? To take people around. But I have kind of like a mini district tour in my mind too, but definitely, even if it were like a very little amount of time, someone came to visit in my home area, I would take them to this one spot. It's also my campaign website. It's like where it's a pho restaurant, so it's a Vietnamese noodle place.
Yes.
But you know, COVID has changed a bit right now, so you won't get the full experience, unfortunately, right now. But it was a really great place that when I was growing up, I would go there a lot. It's got pretty good food. It's not like the best pho in the world, but like what's really unique about it is that, well, what I like about it too, it's also on the border of two towns where I grew up, so that's also why we went to it. It's also a favorite spot of my friends in high school and everyone. It's a favorite spot because of this. It is, one, super affordable. Two, it has some insane hours where it's COVID has of course changed this, but it used to be, I think it used to be open to like 3 a.m. and it would like open again at like 8 a.m. and I'm like, nice. How is this possible? But like literally, you know, you have some fun at night, whatever you're doing, you go and you're like, I need some food, and you're gonna go pho. And that place is super awesome. It's obviously, or it is owned by a Vietnamese family too, found their own business. It's great. I don't know how they sustain these hours, or they did sustain those hours, but it's a great place. And it's just, I think, so indicative of my community, where it's like, you know, it's not the grand theme park I have. I have Great America in my district, or like the beautiful mountains or marshlands and everything. Those places are great too, but like just to get a sense of like a day in the life of someone on a Thursday night, that's the place to go.
That's great. See, you know, it sounds a lot better than my 2:30 in the morning food choices. So, huge huh?
What do you got down there? What's the 2:30 a.m. options?
You know, probably carne asada fries, which is huge, like Southern California thing. Just, you know, amazing. I could live off of carne asada fries, but I could also live off of pho. It's one of my favorites. Got me through the pandemic for sure.
Those are two powerful carb dishes, so it's good.
Yes. So that's any other questions? Let me see if we have other questions from the audience. I see other comments. I don't see questions. Is there anything else you'd like to share? Any last messages or anything you'd like to share before we part today?
Just that, you know, live authentically and prideful of yourself, no matter how challenging it is. We are cresting, I think, into the golden era where, you know, you can really say, this is who I am. You deal with it in a very positive way, right? But like, I think we're getting into that great place where I think the society is becoming more and more accepting of our community and accepting of the very immense diversity within our community. But it's also important to embrace that differences as well, right? Because that will always make our great acronym community the strong community it is. And really, we're really blessed because just by definition, it is always an intersectional community, right? Because no matter their sexual orientation, they'll belong to some culture group, they'll belong to some other group just by definition, which is so amazing. And I think we can learn so much from each other in that way. And I'm always constantly challenged and learning new things from members of our community, from different generations, from different cultural backgrounds. And I think that's the wonderful thing about it. So, you know, always be trying to learn and be prideful of our identity as much as possible. And then also, I think I see the thing going across the screen, but follow me on Twitter and Instagram too. I'm at Alex Lee. I'm also on TikTok. I don't make as many TikToks as I should be, but I'm on TikTok too, and on Facebook too. So on everything, and really hope to see y'all there. And I still run my social media myself, so it's like, it's me, you know. And
it's actually you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, again, Alex, thank you so much for joining us today. It really is a pleasure to watch you work and see some of the stuff coming out of your office. I know you're inspiring folks, even all the way down here in San Diego. You are so young in your career and already doing so much and being a great vocal advocate. I'm sure you have a great career ahead of you. And I look forward to seeing all the things that come out of your office for the years to come.
Thank you, Fernando.
Thanks.
Looking forward to visiting San Diego soon when the pandemic's over.
Yeah, come on down. We'll show you around.
We'll do the 2:30 a.m. carne asada fries.
Perfect. I'm in.
Right on time. Great. Great. Thank you so much.
Alex. And thank you all so much for joining us today for another LGBT Q&A. What a pleasure to speak with Alex. I hope you do follow him on Twitter and all of his social media. I'm not on TikTok, but you can follow him on TikTok. Tomorrow, we're going to be hanging out with Jay Rodriguez, who used to be on Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. He's going to be joining us as we highlight two incredible API artists. And then next Tuesday, we are partnering with Incapia and the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force to talk about the state of the national LGBTQ API movement. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you love the programming that we're still able to bring to you virtually, feel free to donate at sdpride.org/donate and become an annual member. Really appreciate you joining us here today. Take care and happy Pride.